are the talents of this year. Hello everybody, a warm welcome. Thank you very much for joining us here on this really cozy space. We like it. I still get used to it, so if someone wants to lie down over the course of the session, just feel very free because it's a movement and space session, so we thought we'd keep it very open and very relaxed. What we are going to do, welcome again here at Berlinale Talents, or welcome if it's the first time. And as you can see, if you're here for the first time, that our this year's focus is 2015 as space discovery. So we are talking about space, about more or less cinematic space, but not only, of course, we have also the cultural spaces in the back of our minds, the social whatever. So bringing, because we have these 300 talents, lots of you are our talents here, and you're coming from 75 countries this year, so there's lots of space in the meta space in Berlin. So we will mention the word space very often in this session, so be prepared. But what I wanted to do, and this that's the reason why I do it, is we are almost through with our week. Not yet, we still have a lot of sessions today and tomorrow, but we thought, okay, while preparing this one here and talking about it, we realized, okay, lots of things had been tackled already over the course of the week. So when we sat together with Darren Aronofsky in the very first session, and Claudia Jossa, we talked about how they create spaces in their mind, also in the stories, how this outer space works in a film like The Fountain that Darren Aronofsky made. And we had Peter Zeitlinger on Monday, a DOP from Werner Herzog, and he talked about framing, of course. And Ursula Mayer talked about relationships in between actors and her, and how she defines these relationships within the given framework, or even beyond. And all of this we can now in a little bit put on this great carpet here and can discuss it again with a lovely new team that I'm having here. So because Movement in Space, as it was called, is this in a way the name of the title? Is Movement in Space. It's a very long title, I forgot. Probably we should write it down here next time. So everything like this tackles these issues and bring us together. And we have a group here, and I introduce you who is here so that you know them. We keep it very open. That's what we also agreed in the beginning. So if you have a question, if you want to know more, just raise your hand at any time. We'll have microphones and include you into the discussion as we do it, let's say, among colleagues or among friends. But let me introduce you to the people who are here. Directly next to me, it's Mikey Brett. Mikey Brett is a puppeteer and a movement artist, and you might have seen some of his films, probably also some of his stage plays. He worked intensively and creatively on Warhorse at the, I have to look it up, at the National Theatre of Great Britain, and for the Royal Opera House. You have to let me know what's on the Royal Opera House. And then he was also a senior puppeteer for a BBC it's a BBC series. It's a BBC series, Strange Hill High. And what I like a lot, but never can pronounce it correctly, is Mongrels. Mongrels. Puppets. And then there's something that brings them together. It's not the only project they collaborated on, but one project they collaborated together. It's Muppets Most Wanted, wonderful experience, and in this film also Francesca Jaynes was involved as a choreographer. We will work out a little bit more on this and elaborate on what you've done there together. And there's one very important, one huge project they worked together on, and that's Gravity. Francesca, as a choreographer and movement director, and also as a director, because you have also made short films, she worked on plenty of films, and I can't mention them all, but lots of them, the two films from Tim Burton, I mentioned Alice in Wonderland and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and Sweet, oh yeah, another one that's great. Okay. Pick up your microphone. You have microphones, by the way. And many more, and also with particular actors like Christoph Waltz, I think, on particular roles he played or they played. And then next to Francesca, we have a man that you probably know already. So because JeanLouis is with us already for several years here, he's running 2 fantastic workshops.
I haven't moved yet. Here for
yeah. 2 fantastic workshops within the framework of the Acting Studio. So who had the pleasure to be part of the Acting Studio this year or in the years before, worked together with JeanLouis Rodrigue and with Christoph Conrad. So they're doing it together. And I'm looking forward if you want to share something of this year's experience from the workshop. So because it also tackled, of course, the space topic, then feel very free to share it. So, we have gravity on the plate, but we thought, okay, we keep it as open as possible on talking about movement in space in general here. But, so, give them an applause. So, thank you very much. I just wanted to grab this opportunity, having here so fantastic and interesting field of work. So, because you know we are open to plenty of field of works, but we have to think about to open it up to puppeteers, I think, because still not open. So, what is a puppeteer doing? Give us an insight.
So, puppetry, in its most basic form, is taking an inanimate object and bringing it to life. There are so many different styles of puppetry, many of which I've been involved in, some of which I've never touched. But probably the most recognized form in film is the Muppets, which are sort of the epitome of taking a piece of cloth and making it a person and making it, giving you something that you can connect with. But yeah, I guess that also puppetry can extend then into work like Gravity, where there weren't actually puppets. We were manipulating actors in space and creating a style of movement which wouldn't have really been possible without external forces acting on those actors. So yeah, it's kind of, what is a puppeteer is kind of a really broad kind of idea, but it's certainly a field of work which has a lot of applications in film. Yeah, okay. I guess that answers that.
This answered it. Okay, it's a good thing. Francesca, a choreographer, I think we can imagine a little bit what it is, so that at least the word sounds familiar. We know it probably from the theater. Choreographer in terms of film. So what is the essence of it?
That's quite broad as well. Sometimes I go in as a choreographer and I might be recreating a period dance, so that's sort of quite fairly clear cut, really. But at other times I go in, like at the moment I'm working with Tim Burton again, luckily, on a film called Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. And all these children have a kind of peculiarity, which is movement-based. So that's not quite so clear-cut. So I go in and we work on movement, and then I show it to Tim, and we develop it, or change the dynamic. Yeah, and other times, like the Muppet movie was absolutely fantastic because we had huge routines. We had 65 dancers on a kind of Busby Berkeley set, and we had swimmers diving in. It was brilliant. And then about 120 prisoners dancing in a gulag, a Russian gulag. And also working with, I didn't work with Mikey, but other puppeteers, working with Miss Piggy and Kermit. I think it was the most varied film I'd ever worked on, and it was just fantastic. So yeah, choreography and movement, there's a huge crossover. Sometimes the lines are quite clear. A choreographer does that and a director does something else, and other times you work together to find a kind of movement language. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've been very lucky to work on so many different varied projects with some amazing people.
And JeanLouis, You have a film in a way in the festival, so because that's interesting. Because Love, you mentioned you don't have one, but you have one. So because Love and Mercy, which is in Berlinale special, is a film you were somehow involved in with because of Paul Dano. So probably to give us an idea of what you're doing as an acting coach. So what have you done in specific with Paul Dano to prepare him for the film?
Well, usually it starts with a script. So I get the script and I read it, and the idea is to take what's written in terms of as a character and take it from just words into a living human being. Many people think that it makes just the actor invents how this will happen. Unfortunately, most actors who are like Paul Dano, that are working all the time, they actually need a little help. And so the help that I bring is the idea of bringing this particular character, who was Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, into a reality. So there were drinking, there was drug problems, there was a sense of the character having conflicts. And my job was to help him find the physicality. So we take it from the page, everything that is written in the script, and my expertise is make it in a believable way. So there's a lot of research that happens, and it was a lot of fun for me to listen to all the music. I got to listen to all the music. I got to watch a lot of newsreels to study the movements, the behavior, the habits. I also do something called the Alexander technique, which is a study of habits. So in a way, I'm an expert in behavior, and I'm able to bring all of that and help Paul. Now, I've been working with Paul now for some years, so the job of a coach is to help the actor bring into life this character in space.
And how can we imagine it on a practical level when you meet for the very first time? Do you sit down and discuss it for the first place, or do you immediately start to act or to create some kind of an inspirational environment? How does it work?
It depends. Sometimes I have only a few days, and sometimes I have 3 months. It's unusual when I get 3 months, but the longer I have, the more that we can explore and experiment, and I have a whole bunch of exploration exercises, which I've done with the group of actors that I was working here at the Berlinale Talents. They're right there. I think they're applauding. Are you happy still? But I actually do with what I did with Paul, I actually did with them, and I take them through a process of discovery, who this person is, where they live, what's their job, what was their family like. So if Francesca and I were talking about, if you live in a poor family, you're going to have a certain kind of behavior, but if you're a wealthy person with a very large estate, you're going to move differently. So where you've lived, what kind of life you've led, literally what you eat. Brian Wilson ate a lot.
And education as well. Education gives people confidence, and status becomes very important in your physicality, I think, too.
So anyway, so that's so my job is a delicious job. I also give thanks. Thank you, God, because I've been fortunate to work with a lot of great actors and great directors, and it's. But I certainly am hoping that all of us will inspire the young directors to think about movement and to think about this work in terms of your work.
When you created the horses for War Horses, how can we imagine this? And how much was thinking about the physicality of the animal first, and how much was about the practical aspects of later on we have to move this somewhere, and we have to have it on a stage, and it has to work every night, and it has to be stable, and so on.
Well, the creation of the horses for Warhorse was quite a long process, which was undertaken by the South African puppet company, Handspring Puppet Company. And they began simply by looking at how can two people, as they originally envisaged it, it later became three, how can two people realistically convey a sense of a horse through manipulating an object which is external to themselves. And it was from the desire to emulate reality that then all the practical aspects came along. So realizing that the way a horse's back legs move is quite a technical process which can't really be replicated by human legs, and so there was clearly going to have to be some kind of engineering going on in order to make that work. And I think that with a lot of, certainly with Warhorse and with a lot of not serious puppetry, but sort of dramatic puppetry, there's a desire to find what's real, what's absolutely genuine, and go for that as hard as you can. It's very easy to make something very cartoonish and very silly, and so by sort of veering away from that and trying to get what's real and what's accurate and what's truthful, that's where you really find something which an audience can recognize and find a connection with. And even when you get to things like the Muppets, which are very cartoonish, there's still elements of reality in there. You know, they still react to gravity the same way that we do. They still, if you hit them, they still, feel that force and fall, but it just so happens that they can get back up again and they're not hurt. So it's always rooted in some sort of reality. And yeah, by starting from a realistic point, and especially in terms of physics, starting with real physics, then you can sort of go anywhere. And then the practical aspects are then just a case of what do we need to do in order to make this work, in order to make this real, what needs to happen from a technical point of view.
And in Muppets Most Wanted, this is you two work together, and if I recall it correctly, so you were there also as an actor, as a dancer, right?
Yeah, so I'm a puppeteer, but I'm also an actor, and I'm also a movement artist. I do various forms of movement, including dancing.
By the way, does it always come together? Is it if you're a choreographer, or if you want to, do you have to be a dancer? Are you all having a background in dance, like a musician has to play piano, otherwise can't play any other instrument?
I think that probably goes back to how wide the subject is. I trained as a dancer, and I trained in many disciplines, so I can tap dance, I can tango, I can waltz, I can do all sorts of things, and that's helped me in my career because for something like, I did the film about Cole Porter, and for that I needed all those skills. But other people still work and they don't necessarily know how to tap or to do ballet. I think it depends. And I think the work that comes to you, or the work you're attracted to, is because of what's inside your body, what you've learned, how you communicate to other people. And I'm really fortunate that I'm basically what you call a hoofer, I've been lucky enough to work with people that have opened my mind to your world, really, to more of a movement world, which is, it's very different, and I'm lucky that I can combine the two, because one helps inform the other, I think. What I was going to say about Muppets was we had this huge scene, the Gulag scene, and I went to James, the director, who was so open, and I said, look, James, I know you think we're going to have 50 to 100 dancers, but I think we should mix it up. I think we should have actors, we should have dancers, because we're going to get a different dynamic, because you don't want a Russian Gulag to be full of beautiful men, really. I'm not saying all dancers are beautiful, but the way they carry themselves, the way they look, is just different.
So I was hired because I'm not a beautiful man.
So I went to all my male mates, all my actors, and went, do you want to come along and be in a Muppet movie? And they all went, yeah. So I put these boards together, and I gave them all names. Dale, my assistant's here as well, and we gave them all names, all the baddies, Shakespeare baddies, and he laughed and he just went, yeah, okay, fine. So
what was fascinating as well was because from for Gravity, our team was mostly puppeteers, but a lot of people who'd worked in physical theatre. My training is in physical theatre, so there was one of our team was actually a dancer. He's a wonderful tap dancer and musical theatre performer, and so Fran hired him to work on the Muppets in the Busby Berkeley lovely, beautiful choreography scene, and she hired the non-dancers as the sort of
Criminals.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, I think you did make a point though of hiring people who could at least, keep
I did.
time.
Yeah, they did have to be able to move, and it made such a difference to the scene when you see it. They're all dancing, but you just know it's got more weight to it, and their faces are so interesting. And that's a great example of a choreographer or movement director going to the director and saying, look, I've got this idea, and him running with it, and him trusting me. He didn't even ask to audition, he didn't see them. And it's just fantastic when that relationship works.
But one thing, I started as a dancer, but I was so lousy. I was a terrible dancer, and I was so stiff, and that's what got me into being curious about my body, and searching for ways of freeing myself, and that's what got me into this. And I started as an actor also, so acting and movement were natural applications. But all of you, everyone moves. And I believe that every human being is in love with movement, because when you're watching sports, you're watching movement. When you're watching an animal running, you're watching movement. And actually, even when you go to a bar and you're flirting or you're, picking up, right? On, what is it, Saturday night here? Mm-hmm. Is that when you go to the bar? Friday night?
Every night.
You're watching movement, right? You're watching and seeing how people move and dance, and I think we're attracted by how people move. And 75% of communication is done by the body, and I think it's what is it? 12% your voice tone, and unfortunately, it's only about 12% what's written on the script. So it's the body movement is huge.
So I'm sure I absolutely agree, and I think we all agree on that. Movement is essential in life as well as in film. So because it's a moving thing. So we just have an interesting workshop going on in another venue with a photographer, and he's not at all in movement. So it's the opposite. It's just like this. Really, let's see what is there on a stable, on a non-moving. What kind of stories do we tell in this direction? That's also interesting. But normally, film is of course movement. But what is about space? So what is about how you say movement is present? Is space something? It's probably a silly question, but we should tackle it. So is space something you think about when you move? When you work. Also probably when you move. So, but in work itself. So is it?
Do you want to?
Well, it's really interesting because when we were talking about space, I realized that I never think about space when I choreograph or when I'm working something out, because I might be working a dance routine in a rehearsal room, which looks great to me, and then we put it in situ, we put it on the set, and the director will shoot from various angles. He or she will tell the story that they want to tell, and it can look completely different. I think what I'm trying to say is I have to present or give a director what they need in order to tell their story, and then I have to let it go, because they can't shoot it like Fred Astaire, in Fred Astaire's time. They've got to tell. There's always going to be a narrative running alongside the movement or the dance. So it's really interesting because it has made me think about why I don't think about the space, and I think that's why. And if you take, I'll give you an example in terms of movement. I worked on Mike Leigh's film Topsy Turvy. It was the first film, and I will be forever grateful because he taught me so much. He taught me how to work, how to research, and we researched the etiquette of the period, which included the way people moved, their education, the way they were taught dance and deportment, and there were so many rules. And we discussed it with the actors. They had lots of sheets of paper to go away in that Mitely way. You work and work and work and research before you stand up and speak. And there's this fantastic scene because men had a different physicality when women were in the room. So like now, okay, you would sit like that. You'd be very straight-backed. You might even take, if you were going to visit someone, you might even take a newspaper so that you could do something with your hands, like that. Yeah, so you weren't awkward. Now, when there were no women, you were allowed to cross your legs, you were allowed to put your hand back, you were allowed to lean. Yeah, and there's a scene in the D'Oyly Carte office, it's probably only me that would ever notice it, but there's this scene and there's one woman and they're talking about rehearsals and it's really, really hot and she's going out for ice cream and all the men are like this and she finishes what she has to say and leaves and they all relax. And that was not designed, that was because actors take that information and they make it their own. And in the improvisation, that's what happened. And that's when research and movement, it takes on a life of its own. And if you watch that, and then the tension changes, and the dynamic of the scene changes. I can't remember why I started saying, oh yeah, so that's, sorry, I do this a lot. And that's the thing about space, that's the same space, with the same characters, but the movement changes. So I think that's why I don't really think, I probably will now though, but I haven't really thought about the space. It's always character, it's character driven or narrative driven.
So I have a really good story about space. So I was hired by Ang Lee to work on the tiger movement in Life of Pi, and I was supposed to help Ang and his screenwriter to write down all the movement things of the tiger within the script. So everything was scripted as to what was going to show in the image. So there was one scene, how many of you have seen the film? Raise your hands. Oh good, so a lot of you have seen it. So at the very end, when Pi lands in Mexico, remember that scene? And he's coming out of the boat and he's almost dying. And the tiger is very thin. Richard Parker is very thin, the tiger. So they both land, and Pi is crawling. The boy's crawling on the beach, right? So you see, I should do it. So he's crawling on the beach like this, right? And he can hardly, and the tiger jumps over him like this, right? And then it goes to the edge of the jungle over there, right? And at this point, Pi wants Richard Parker, the tiger, to turn around and say goodbye. And so in the script, the first draft that I got, the camera sees the tiger's face and it turns around and sees Pi's. And I said, oh no, you can't do that. It's a wild tiger. It wouldn't turn, it said. You make it Disney. That's Disney. You can't do that. So I said, instead, have the tiger just keep looking at the jungle and have the camera look at the back of the head as Pi is down on the sand. And he sees all that. So the space between Pi and the tiger became very, very electric. And that's the scene where everybody dies, right? The whole audience is in tears. So that idea of space and not turning the head was huge. And it was on the page, so we made changes in that relationship. And the way it was shot, it's exactly the way that we rewrote it. So that was cool.
Creating this electricity and for Tiger, creating this electricity also with a puppet. It would be also interesting for me to know if, how do you do it? So how do you bring it? Is it you yourself somehow giving this to the puppet, or is the puppet something that has its own character, electricity, as Jean-Louis said?
The way that I tend to think about it is that it's almost like you need to be able to be outside of yourself looking at what you're doing. You can sort of train yourself to be, it's like body awareness. Like you train yourself to know what your body is doing without you having to look in a mirror. And you do the same thing with puppets. It's sort of no good if you're, if for example, okay, if I've got a Muppet, okay, it's sort of no good if you're concentrating too much on what your hand's doing, because that won't tell you anything. You need to be looking at your monitor and looking at what the character is doing, and just, it's almost like you imagine that you're directing a character. It's like, okay, I want him to look that way, and then I want him to cock his head, and I want him to say, yeah, sure, why not? And then it's kind of like, and you kind of need to not think that means that my hand has to do this, and then I have to do this, and I have to speak at the same time. You just kind of need to think of it in terms of its own separate character. When it comes to sort of how I view space, I always think of it in very practical ways, very technical ways. A lot of my work is quite technical. And it's almost like, especially with that kind of puppetry, you're looking at your monitor and that is your space. That's all the space you have, and anything you do outside of that space doesn't matter. It's totally irrelevant. So what you're doing with your own body is sort of irrelevant to what the puppet is doing, insofar as the audience will never know. So as long as the puppet looks right, it's all good. It means that puppeteers end up smushed into tiny spaces, and we end up with our elbows in each other's eyes, and I was saying before, all puppeteers have brilliant personal hygiene because you get really close to each other, so it's sort of a must. And it's never about what it is, it's always about what it looks like. So when it comes to film work, as far as I'm concerned, your space is your frame. And anything that happens outside of that isn't really that relevant to the work that I do, personally. That's not to say all puppeteers feel the same way. But then obviously when you're on stage, it's about everything. It's about, how does the puppeteer look, because an audience can see them. So as soon as you get into film medium, where all the audience can see is the puppet, or in some bizarre cases, the person on screen, it suddenly becomes a much smaller space that you actually have to think about. And for me, I guess, a filmic space, insofar as the work I do, is literally just the space inside the frame.
So talking about the frame, so could we say, what would you say? So would you agree that space, probably cinematic space, is defined by the restrictions, by the constraints? So and probably what kind of, you mentioned this already, it's a technical frame, of course, the framing of what is, and also probably the physical restrictions, and how do you react on this? How when you come in touch with an actor and you see, okay, this is the limit, what do you do? Do you push the limit? Do you accept it? What?
I think again that's you should never limit the actor, I don't think, and that's going back to what I said about not thinking about space. If I were to think too much about space, for instance, if you were doing some kind of comedic routine where the feet and the legs are really, really important, and you see it like a mid-shot and you don't see any of the feet and legs, you can't change, you can't adjust, because whatever the actor's doing with their feet and legs has an impact on the top half of the body. So for me, I don't see it as a restriction. And funnily enough, I think, because I work quite a lot in the theatre as well, and I started off in the theatre and then went into film, and I probably do more film than theatre, but I think I've become a better choreographer in theatre because of film, because of kind of deep shots, because of so many different stories sometimes that are going on in one shot. I think I've become better at staging people in the theatre.
I think also, and this is an interesting issue, is how well you're working with the director. The directors that really want a coach or a choreographer or a movement artist on set, they want to work with and collaborate together. And we often, what I do with the actors is invisible, meaning that it's all preparation. It's done before the shoot starts, rather than being on the set. So it really depends what you want to do. So collaboration is really important, really important.
Yeah, and when it comes to sort of restrictions, I think that a lot of that does come from a director. And if you're given the freedom as a performer or as a movement director or choreographer, if you're given the freedom to sort of do whatever works well for you, and then the director can work out his framing around that, that is amazing. I've been lucky enough to work recently on some digital puppetry and motion capture as well, and using fantastic virtual cameras. It just means that you can basically do whatever you like and they can choose the shot later. It's amazing. It just frees up movement work so much in ways which I never really thought would be possible. It means that you can just perform as though, almost as though it's a play, as though it's on stage. You can just, you have the freedom to perform across the whole space in front of you, and then the director can choose their shots later. And that's really fantastic. I mean, I honestly think that it's the future of sort of really movement-intensive film work. But yeah, so a lot of it is down to the director. And as Jean-Louis was saying, having a really good collaboration with the director is so important. And I mean, we've all been lucky enough to work with fantastic directors who are very collaborative and very willing to listen to ideas and to change ideas as well based on what's working in the moment. And I think that, yeah, by not being too prescriptive, you can really help movement work along.
And given the fact that I can't afford a choreographer, or I'm a tiny little filmmaker, it's me, myself, and I, and I'm doing it. And there's something, I have my script now, and I see, okay, sometimes I now have to get this into movement. so it's paperwork. And what would be your first advice? So if I have a look and there's a kitchen scene, for example, and so how do I discover this space? What would you recommend? Going to many kitchens, have a look at it, or...
There's a kitchen
scene. For example, a kitchen. So because we have in the camera studio, we build up a kitchen these days, and it was very interesting how how different the DOPs in that case reacted on this kitchen. And what would you give them as advice?
Well, it's a scene set in a kitchen, so it's fairly domestic, is it? Mm-hmm. And okay. This is quite.
I'm just curious to find out. So what is your approach to a space? So if it's just written down, there's something said like a kitchen. Okay, there's an old man or something. So you have some information. And how do you put this together in the first place?
I would definitely start, like I was saying, it's all about what's real. So I would definitely start with the very simple question of what do people do in a kitchen? It's no good sort of having this kind of elaborate sort of shouting match in a kitchen or having an elaborate fight in a kitchen without somehow alluding to the fact that it is a kitchen. Like Francis, it's a domestic space. It's like people use it for a purpose, and
you'd want to know why somebody was sitting there. Why? So again, you'd go back to the narrative and the character and find out why they're sitting there, how long they're going to be sitting there, and that's how I would start. This is a film you're going to make?
Florian's Kitchen.
The kitchen movie.
I worked on a film a few years ago with Mary McDonnell. It was a John Sayles film called Passion Fish, and the main character was a paraplegic. So she was in a wheelchair, and so we worked on bringing the reality of what it is like to be in in a wheelchair. Strangely enough, the actress, her biggest problem was her head-neck relationship. She was so stiff up here, but yet in the movie, that was the only part that she could move, because everything else was completely still. So we had to figure out how to express the character from this area here up. So I helped her relax her neck and have better coordination. Breathing helped enormously. But we worked for weeks in the wheelchair to make it happen. And she got nominated for an Oscar, so that was pretty good. She did a good job. But then, you know, she had a scene where she fell down from the wheelchair and she had to crawl around, and she did break a lot of dishes. She was very angry.
Okay. We tackled some of the outer spaces now, so we tackled some issues, given again the kitchen or some. So what we also had discussed, for example, with Walter Salles on Sunday, we discussed a lot about the inner spaces. So like the spaces that are here inside, and how the movement is here in the side. And if you meet up with an actor and says, how do you create this relation to something that is inside him or herself, and how much are you allowed to influence what's happening here inside, and how much do you have to react and respect what has to be kept in his self?
That really varies from actor to actor. Some actors like a lot of help. They like to talk a lot. They might want you to do exercises. Other actors don't want any help at all. So every time I work on a film, it's always different, and you just have to respond to them, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you have to have a really good relationship with the actor and respect. You never tell them what to do. They work with you with procedures and exercises, and if they don't have a lot of time in between jobs, you see sometimes they're going from one job to another, then you have to help them to. But again, it has a lot to do with respect in terms of finding who is this character and what they want to do in terms of discovery of the character. But that's, the private space is delicate, really delicate.
Have you ever experienced a moment, you don't have to mention the name, but experienced a moment where there was some kind of a full restriction, like no,
yes,
don't enter this space?
It was, I suggested, I probably went better not say who it was, but she was lovely, and I suggested some exercises to help, and she just went, no, I just feel stupid doing that. So I said, okay, that's fine, and went on to something else. Luckily, I had visuals to show her. But she's a very intelligent woman, and you have to go, okay, yeah. Whereas other actors would go, oh, yeah, great, yes. I'll pretend my body's filling up with sand, that's fine. It's, and that's the great thing about our job, isn't it? It's...
I mean, it's kind of interesting, as an actor, as a performer, it's kind of interesting, not only sort of knowing that every actor has a different process, but also the different processes that different choreographers and movement directors and movement coaches bring to you, and sort of, obviously not everything works for everybody, and so there have been times when, things have been suggested to me, I'm like, no, I would feel like a dick doing that. So, there are times when it does become a matter of, I mean, it's not one of my most favorite phrases, but a matter about feeling like you're in a safe environment, and that you can be, because it can be very exposing, doing exercises and research as an actor. And so I guess a lot of the time it is about finding something where you feel like you are able to share that bit of yourself without feeling too exposed. And like Fran said, having something else up your sleeve to say, okay, we don't have to do that, we can do this instead. It helps actors feel very secure, I think, and helps their confidence in you as well.
And I think it's really hard on film because you're often working with maybe just one actor. And you're right, they do feel exposed. Whereas in the theatre, you might be working with an ensemble. So, there are 10 people discovering what it's like to do something odd in order to, feel something or establish a movement, a language for that particular piece. So I think it is hard. And there are a lot of film actors who haven't had any theatre experience or been in a rehearsal room with a lot of people. So it's not that they're not willing, it's just they have different ideas of finding their character.
And is it just popped up in my mind? So is it normally the case that different actors, especially if it comes up to more popular actors or well-known, that they have different choreographers, and do these choreographers meet for a beer in the night and then they agree on how they do the characters the next day? So how does it work? So if some different choreographers talking with different people and actors and tell them, okay, this is my way of understanding the story, and another choreographer might tell something totally different?
I've never
No?
come up. No.
No, because it's more teamwork or group work.
Yeah, and I don't think, bless the actors, I don't think they get that much of a say. I think,
Okay.
the director or the producer or whoever will have asked a choreographer or movement director to work. I mean, it's happened to me where I know I've got the job subject to meeting the actor. And so we have, we either just have a chat or we actually have a little session before it's confirmed that I'm going to do the job, which is great, and that shows respect, I think. If you're going to work, it is very intense working one-to-one. I've done it quite a few times. It's hard on an actor, but can be really rewarding too.
Yeah.
And in film, what you do is also very often, I worked with Josh Brolin on doing George Bush, and what we would do is we would do the choreography of the movement with the makeup and everything, then we would shoot it, we would do tests, and then we would send it to the director and he would look at it and agree whether we were in the right direction. And so there was that constant back and forth until it worked. And the actors are happy to get that help because sometimes they don't have a sense of what it looks like.
So before we move onward to Gravity and see a clip of from the set, is there any question from the audience? Is there something that you would love to? There's a question. We have microphones on both sides, so just wait for a second.
Can I be greedy and ask a couple of questions? One was about Alexander technique, I don't know what that was. And Mike Lee telling you how to research, what was that? And one more thing was about John Sayles, which is relevant to this, but didn't he do a thing where he starts the take, but there's already a improvised context before that scene starts, and then you're rolling into the shot, and then he decides where the scene starts later on. Is that working with John Sayles? Is there anything you can add to on the context of this discussion?
Yeah. Sorry, I got the first two. I wasn't quite sure.
Sorry, you're talking about Passion Fish earlier on, and I know that.
Passion Fish.
You were talking about Passion Fish.
Which one?
And John Sayles.
I'd like to know.
That I read a book of his, and he says that he improvises. If it's not in the script, he'll work out what happened before that moment started, and then so the actors are moving and rolling into the scene before you cut into it. So if you're in a kitchen, like you were discussing, then there's a context and there's action already taking place, so it doesn't feel like you just started the camera. Or
Well, if the actors are freer, and it's funny that you mentioned the Alexander technique. If the actors have an understanding of their body and their habits, and they are actually freer, and they can make greater changes in the degrees of what's going on the set. Actors that are unaware of their bodies cannot really they can just move the way they do habitually, which includes their tensions. But in terms of Mary, well, she is a theater-trained actress, so she knew a lot about her body, and with the Alexander work, just gave her a greater vocabulary of movement that most people don't have. Or they have just a certain kind of, maybe they can just play jazz. Sometimes a jazz musician cannot play classical. You see, it's a little bit harder that way. So it just gave them greater, does that answer your question?
Yeah, sorry, it was a very rambly question. I apologize. There was like 10 questions in one.
All right.
Did you want to know about Mike Leigh and research? Yeah. With Topsy Turvy, there was so much research because it was a period piece. But even when Mike makes a modern piece, what happens is, say you've got two families that meet at some point within the film, they will work independently, sometimes for months and months. They might be in two different houses. They'll never meet until they meet the first time doing an improvisation. So, and that kind of research, it comes down to whether a character has a cat or not. There are great stories about Mike Leigh following people to the supermarket, and they're buying something, and he'll lean over their shoulder and go, well, you don't have a dog, so why are you buying dog food? And it was an actor just buying, thought, I'll do it now while I've got some time. So, and whether the character smokes, whether, what their education is, what their job is. I think it was Career Girls, Andy Serkis went and worked in the city in London for months in an environment that he hated, absolutely hated, but ended up being friends with these people. He said it really, really messed with his head. So that's the extreme that actors go to in a Mike Leigh film. They really, really inhabit the character that they start off actually physically. They talk to Mike about, it varies, but sometimes it can start off with 100 people they know. And the actor will talk about all those people, and then they'll whittle it down and down and down till maybe it's 3. And then they will walk around as those characters. And finally they will decide on one. So it's not an exact copy of somebody, but it's a bit like you're talking about being a puppeteer and the characters being based in reality. They're always based in some kind of reality. Has that answered your question? Yes. I could talk about that for a long time.
Here we have another question.
Okay, my name is Godfrey. I'm from Ghana. I'm a film student. Okay, so you're working with an actor who you believe is very good, and you've given him a script. He's busy, so you don't get the chance to really have time to rehearse, but he's good, and you don't have money to hire a coach. You're trying to use a space, and he's not really giving you what you want. What do you do?
You're asking all 3 of us?
You.
Me? What would I do? Oh, shit.
What would you do, Jean-Louis?
Well, if you don't have a coach, I think that you have to educate yourself in terms of getting information, in terms of playing games with them, exploring with them, finding out ways, which I do. That's what I do with actors. I do all kinds of very simple games that makes them more aware of their bodies. They give them time. I think actors, especially on set, feel stressed out because there's no time. And especially when you have a limited budget, you have, but you could take some time to prepare. Maybe you could take a few days to play these games to relax them more and be more focused. And also you can play games. Let's say that your script is about war and about soldiers. You can find out ways of getting them to fight and also to do the opposite, to take care of each other. Things that will bring their humanity out that might relate to the script. But again, you know, these are very basic games that most acting teachers know about, but directors sometimes don't know about. I always love to have directors take my class. We had a few, right? And I was so happy that we... So I would encourage you to go to acting classes yourself, even before you do. But even going to a dance class in your country, you know, sometimes it's amazing what really getting into the culture of expression in your own country can give you as a director. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Thank you very much.
I hope I have.
There's one question over there, and then we, I think, go ahead with the clip.
Hello. I would like to ask, how much do you think that it is the mind, the thoughts, and the feelings that move the body? Or how much of the body motion can influence the way of thinking? And I think, I guess that, you know, there is an answer on that, but the point, the way that, the reason that I'm asking this question is that I would like to know what is your starting point? Is it the feelings and the thoughts, or is it the body? Because your work as a choreographer, I guess that it is the body movement.
The thoughts.
The thoughts.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the thoughts that the character has, that you read in the script and you believe that the character should have these thoughts or feelings, or is it the actor that comes with his thoughts and feelings and then you work together on that?
I would always start with the character. Okay. You're talking about the character as a third person?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's how I would work, and I think that's probably how most actors work.
Yeah, there's different schools of thought around that. It depends on sort of what style of piece you're going for. If you're going for something that's very stylized and like something like really traditional, like Brecht style, then you'd probably start from movement. But it then becomes sort of demonstrative and not necessarily truthful. Whereas, you know, most acting training nowadays is very Stanislavski based and very about finding the truth of a character and the truth of a moment. And so for that reason, yeah, it does need to come from thoughts and feelings because that is the most truthful thing. And I think for me, a lot of the time it also comes from habits and also from instinct. Like what instinctively would this character do at this time? If they weren't thinking necessarily, if it was more about feeling and about instinct, how would they hold themselves? How would they walk? How would they respond physically without having time to process an actual thought? What would their body naturally do? But it still comes back to what would that character's body do? A lot of it is very much. It all comes back to the same thing about rooting it in truth and reality, and about, you know, these habits and things. They all come from knowing your character and from really. Mike Lee's really got the right idea. It's about knowing your character inside out, but not everybody has months and months to prepare.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with Mikey that in film it's about reacting as the character, and I study animals a lot and animal behavior, and I think animals teach us how to be truthfully living in your body, because animals use their bodies in totality. Every animal, whether it's a mouse or a dog or a cat or a snake, they will respond very much with what's going on in the moment. And that's what you get in film, is response, reaction in the moment, but truthfully to the situation and to who the character is.
Yeah, because then that's how you create tension and drama, by then having the conflict within a character between what they instinctively feel and what they intellectually know, and sort of, I've heard it said many times that it's much more interesting to watch someone on screen trying not to cry than watching someone cry, and it's about sort of finding that balance between thought and feeling, really.
Because I work with animal work sometimes, and actually we had a dance scene in Sweeney Todd, and I knew that it was, a period dance, and I also knew that that wouldn't be quite enough for a Tim Burton film. But you have to be really careful in a period film. You can make things, you can heighten things, but you can't move away from any frame of reference. So you can't do something that was, 100 years later, because it wouldn't work. So I decided to look at animals, because the scene is basically a rape scene. So I thought, well, if we looked at animals that weren't particularly pleasant, like pigs, and although pigs are lovely, but pigs and frogs and birds. And so I asked, and they were dancers, they weren't actors. And I said, look, I've got this number that I'd really like you to do, but I'd like you to kind of keep an open mind. And it was actually fantastic. And we worked on this animal movement, and I choreographed the number. And then I said, all right, okay, we're going to try this animal movement. And we did it percentage basis, which we've talked about. So you can do it at 100%, so it's really, really full animal, and then 50%, and then take it down to 20% or even 10%, and you might just get a tiny little tick of an animal. So then Tim came to see it, and I said, okay. And for someone like Tim Burton, he doesn't particularly like to talk in the way that, say, Mike Leigh likes to talk. He likes to see it. So I said, okay, I've done this, I'm going to do it 2 ways. And we did it the first time at 50%, and then I said, okay, right, now do it at 90%. And I said to Tim, this might be too much, but just have a look. So we did it, and he went, yeah, that one, and walked out. And if you could see, which is great, that works really well for me. And if you see it, if you watch it, if you get a chance to watch it, you can kind of see that it works. It gives it a heightened dynamic and slightly nastier than it would have been, I think, if we hadn't have used that idea.
So what kind of animal was it? Was it a combination of animals or one?
No, I got each dancer, they were to study a particular animal. So we had, and they had masks actually, which they were given. I didn't realise they were going to be given animal masks, so it was great. And there was a frog, and there was a pig, and there were some birds, and a fox, I think, so kind of feral type animals. So when it came to moving in, instead of just kind of walking in a very sort of early Victorian way, they moved in like that. And suddenly the whole thing was nasty.
Shall we have a look at the clip? So it's to move to outer space. We haven't talked about this. We prepared something like a tiny little. You will meet these two again in the clip. It's a making of scene from Gravity. So go ahead. Francesca, what kind
Great
of...
to be reminded of it.
Yeah, interesting. Way back on the memory lane.
Yeah, we shot that in 2011.
Yeah. What kind of character is this Ryan Stone? So the role that Sandra Bullock is playing, and what is her relation to space?
I think all the way through the film, really, the whole story was her being so focused on survival. You don't really get to know very much. Well, you get to know a lot actually because of that. Her strength, her determination, her sadness. But it's really interesting because it's all about the physicality. And yet, in a way, the physicality was the same all the way through because of this focus, because she was always trying to fix something, she was trying to get somewhere. The physicality was all in the same direction almost, apart from when she takes everything off and she allows herself to give in to the natural movement of the body in zero gravity, and it's quite beautiful. It's really beautiful. And Alfonso, the first thing he said to me was that he is passionate about the way a body moves in space, and to him it's poetry. And that's what they wanted to make sure. They knew that the film was going to be about so many technical issues, technology. She was going to be very lonely. We weren't going to be able to communicate with her because we couldn't, especially with the helmet on, we couldn't communicate. So she was very, very lonely. And so, yeah, part of our job was the biggest part of our job was to make sure that poetry of motion was there all the time. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. How much poetry is in the technique then? So how do you bring poetry and the technical devices together?
Well, my team was hired specifically for that purpose. They specifically sought out performers who had experience of movement and also puppetry, and especially large-scale puppetry. So the majority of our team had worked on Warhorse. We were, and the core members, we had 4 sort of core members of our team, myself, Robin Guyver and Avi Leventis had all worked on Warhorse and all had background in physical theatre, and Tom Woods was a dancer and had also done puppetry as well. And so they specifically brought on board people who could bring a sort of poetry, a sort of meaning to movement. They could have, as Alan said in the video, they could have programmed all of the movements into a computer and it would have done it. But then there's no room for expression there. There's no room for Sandra to change her mind. There's no room for Alfonso to come up with a great idea at the last minute. And so by bringing in people who intrinsically have an instinct for movement and for sort of physical language, it meant that...
Rhythm.
In the sense of rhythm as well, yeah. It meant that we could have a really good working relationship between ourselves and Sandra and Alfonso, which, as Avi said in the video as well, it meant that we would finish sort of what was needed for the take, and we could sort of keep going and keep improvising and keep playing, just in case anything else great came out of that. And it was a really fabulous experience. And Alfonso, I think, very much saw us as a really helpful bridge between his creative vision and the technological side of things and what could practically be achieved. Because as movement artists, you know, it's part of our remit to be able to have a sense of the creative and the technical at the same time. You know, we know technically how the limbs need to move in order to look right for zero gravity, but we also know creatively what's needed in order to convey the emotion of the scene. And so, yeah, I feel very much like Alfonso saw us as a useful connection to the technical side of things.
We keep it open to the audience, so we started already with the Q&A, so if you have new questions or other questions you want to raise, just go ahead so that we make the most of the time we have. Here's a question, right ahead.
Hi. I've got a question. When you work in a film, do you also work together with a cameraman, or do you also do the camera movement?
No. No. It's quite clear on set. I don't know whether you've come across that, but it's very clear that, that's not something you get involved with. Saying that, again, it does depend, and if I get on, it's not about getting on with the director, but I worked with Rob Letterman on a film called Gullivers, and it was his first live action, and we got on really well, and there was something that wasn't quite working timing-wise, and I suggested something, only because I felt that he was open to it, and that we were both comfortable, but he was comfortable with it. But normally, no, the director and DOP, it's like, yeah.
There were moments in the filming of Gravity where there was one Steadicam operator in particular who we just found a really nice rhythm between what he needed to achieve the shot he was trying to get and what we needed in order to convey the emotion of the scene, and also to really add to the drama of the scene. And we ended up it was almost like choreographing a piece of movement as the camera came past Sandra, what our team and what she needed to do in order to really hit the right mark in frame, but also to keep her movement going, so that it wasn't that we were just serving the cameraman's needs, so that we were really keeping the story going, but at the same time achieving a beautiful shot. So there's a possibility of sort of loose collaboration with camera operators and with DOPs in that sense, but for the most part, yeah, it's very much a sort of very separate departmental divide, as it were.
Yeah. Great, so many questions. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I want to ask, my question is for all of you. Have you ever worked with maybe some actors who made your work a little bit difficult for you? And if yes, how can you, using space now, for example, how can you, what kind of technique can you apply to get the best out of an actor that has maybe a huge ego problem or something?
Yeah, let's talk about the ego problem.
Ask them what they think. I would probably take their lead more. I would throw the questions back at them and ask them what they thought they needed from me, if anything. And actually, there was somebody on Sweeney Todd, somebody who I admire a lot. He's quite brilliant, but he wasn't used to working with anybody. He was used to working with a writing partner. And the production had obviously sent him up to my room to go over something. And, Sweeney Todd's one of those pieces where a lot of the musical numbers don't need any staging because it's really narrative driven. So Tim would talk them through it as he would a scene without music. And this particular number kind of fell between two stools. So I knew he was coming, and I really wanted to meet him. And he came in and, shall I do it? And I've never done this. What do I do? What do you do? And it was really funny. And I realized immediately that he was the kind of person who did a lot of work on his own. And I thought that I just went with my instinct. So I said, look, I don't have to, I'm not going to tell you anything. I can just use the tape machine. I can run the tape machine for you. If you want me, if you want to use me as a sounding board, do that. And he went, oh, okay. So he started to go through the number. And then I just pretended I wasn't really looking at him, but I was. And there was something he was going over and over again. And so I just suggested something, and it was really, really tiny, and I was really tentative. And he took it on board, and he said, oh, yeah. And then from that moment, we were able to work together. I was still on the back foot. But that's what directors and producers need from us. They need us to read situations because every situation is different. And he's a fantastic performer and he's brilliant in the film. And it just wouldn't have been right if I'd forced my own ideas onto him. So that's the answer to your question, really. Yeah.
And sometimes what you can do is you can suggest it in a very clever way so it sounds like they came up with it They invented it. Oh, yeah, I know that. I can do that. But they think they came up with it. But when you get really good, you know how to read human behavior, and so you're serving the director and you're serving the actor without infringing on their territory.
Yeah, because sometimes it feels like some actors might feel that you're imposing an idea, and the director's not in the room too. So, it comes from a place. He hadn't been to drama school. He hadn't been in that situation before. So, I understood where he was coming from.
Any ego problems with Kermit?
No, Kermit's got a great ego. He's so down to earth. And
a great dancer.
Yeah. I think in film I've mostly been lucky enough to work with very ego-less people. In theatre, slightly less so. But yeah, I think it really does just boil down to not necessarily pandering to people, but there's no point in trying to shout down someone's ego, because that won't work. That will just make them put up more barriers because they're convinced that they're right. And so the best way to do it is, gently, softly, and yeah, I'm a big fan of suggesting something simple and making it sound more complicated than it is, so that then they do it and they're like, oh, this is easy, and it's like, yeah, it is, well, there you go, and then you can just sort of move on from there. And yeah, making them think they had the idea first is always a winner. Oh my gosh, that works so well. It's like, oh, didn't I hear you mention this before about this? And because of their ego, they'll always say, oh yeah, that was my idea.
And sometimes it's fear. It's not always ego, it's fear. If they know someone's going to, just the word choreographer can really scare an actor. So it's about making them feel safe and that they can achieve something too in a short space of time, because everybody can. Everybody can.
There was a question at the back.
Listening to you, I have to think of this romantic German writer, Kleist, who wrote about puppets and dancers, and his theory is that puppets are the better performers because they don't have a conscience of their own body, because the center of gravity is outside this wooden thing. So I wonder, and they are not vain because they have no conscience of themselves. They are not vain. They are in this character. That's it. So the simple question is, who's easier material? Who's easier to work with? Dancers, real people, or puppets?
Oh, that's hard.
Well, it's not quite as hard for me to answer, because actually I work with the puppeteers who create the movement, and I have been absolutely amazed, and I've fallen in love with every puppeteer I've ever met. But it's to do with what you're saying. The puppeteers, it's like their ego's on the back foot, because they're creating this character that everybody loves. And even though we know it's about the puppeteers, for the audience it's not. So puppeteers don't seem to have any ego at all, and they work so collaboratively. It's utterly brilliant. So, I love dancers. They'll do the same thing if you need them to, all day long in the same spot. I love them, and I love puppeteers. I just love people who move.
I find it interesting that you say that puppets aren't vain, when one of the most famous puppets in the world is Miss Piggy, and she's the vainest character. And so it's interesting. I was talking to these guys about a puppet company I work with quite often, and their characters are vain and pushy and bossy and mean, and the puppets are horrible to the puppeteers. It's brilliant, and so I think that whilst I think that I agree with Fran, puppeteers are easier to work with than puppets, and like you say, dancers are bloody hard-working, and they will just rehearse if they have to.
But what you've just said explains the way I feel about puppeteers. I've just realised why I like them so much.
I want to say something about that too. I think that puppeteers, because they're behind, or they're dressed in black, they're in a way somewhat more pure, because I think they want to serve the story and they want to serve the character, so they're in a way more open to telling the story. Actors can do that, actually. I think the really good actors are the ones that disappear, and you don't see them.
Yeah.
Marion Cotillard is an actress like that. You hardly see her in the characters she plays. Amazing, absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it's true. Puppeteers, our job is to be invisible. Our job is to not be noticed and to, I mean, who can name any famous puppeteers? It's like, you know, the most famous puppeteer in the world is Jim Henson, and he's been dead a while, you know? It's like, there aren't really famous puppeteers. There are famous puppets, there are tons of famous puppets, but there are very few famous puppeteers. And yeah, I think there is something, about, there's a need to serve the story and a need to, what I always say, whenever I'm teaching puppetry, I always say that what is here, the puppet, that is an important thing. This, not an important thing. Like, you are, as a puppeteer, you're probably the least important person on stage or on set. What you're doing can be the most important thing, but you are not important. And I think that, or at least, you know, not important to the story. And so I think that probably goes some way to explaining why puppeteers have a sort of meek existence, I guess.
Yeah, before we have to round it up, there's one last question here, please.
Hi, this relates to a few things that were said, but I'm a director, and I actually took acting classes for the very reasons you were mentioning, to try to understand what goes on. And I found that I can't really understand why sometimes I was just present and there, and sometimes it would just disappear. And I never really figured out what would cause that. It seems like kind of this magic to me still. And when I've been directing, sometimes it'll be this kind of intimate scene and everyone's there and it's really present, and then suddenly it feels like one of the actors starts overthinking it and suddenly they're not there anymore. And it's like take 3 and we're about to go for lunch and there's 20 people around. I was wondering if you have any kind of tricks or secrets to help ground the person in their character in that moment.
Personally, as a performer, it's so easy to overthink things. It's so easy to be in a moment, which, especially if you do theatre, because you've done the same thing night after night after night for a year sometimes, and that's why it's always best. Like, theatre is always best when someone's been doing it for a little while, like not too long that they've been bored of it, but long enough that they don't have to think about it, that they can just do it without thinking, so that it's spontaneous and natural, and it's the words coming out of their mouth aren't because they're remembering how they look on the page. They're not remembering reading a script. They're saying them because they're coming from their brain. Their brain is just spouting them out without thinking about it. And so I would say that it might be that it's just a case of I always think that there's always time to sort of down tools and say, okay, let's breathe, have a moment, think about it now, so that you don't have to think about it when we're doing the take. You know, get all your thoughts out of the way now, and then just clear them and just speak it as though it's just, you know, a thought that's popped into your head. Because once you start overthinking it, it's really hard to then not keep overthinking it. And especially if you've got a director pressuring you and saying, you're still overthinking it, go again. It's like, well, now I'm really overthinking it because now I'm thinking about the fact that you're pissed off at me. So I would say there's always time to sort of go, okay, let's take stock. Okay, go again. It is a tricky one, though.
Yeah, and then the other thing is, that's the subject of today, one of the subjects, the body. The body is what keeps presence. All of you know that you're in this theater and that you're watching us because you can feel your butts. Maybe some of them are starting to feel achy, but you can feel your weight on your butt, and you can feel the weight on your, how your muscles are contorted on the chairs and how you're breathing. So the presence of the body is what allows you to be present. The moment that you're not in your body, then you go into your head and you begin to think about what's going on instead of really just being present, like an animal. Animals are always present, always present. They never get lost in their heads. It doesn't mean that they're not thinking in their way, but they just have a greater physical connection. The other thing that I can say for directors is imagine that you're always on the edge of something. So everybody, go ahead and get on the edge of your chairs now. Just get on the edge and really and do this, go forwards and backwards on your sits bones and really keep your feet on the ground. And you will feel a lot more alert in terms of where you are, right? It seems like now you're ready to do something, correct? So you're not in your heads, but you're much more here, you know, in terms of, so when you're working with actors, even if they're just slouching on the couch, you have to get them to slouch not in a habitual way, but rather they can be relaxed in a dynamic way, in a carbonated way, because anyway, you don't want people to go to sleep in your movie. You want them, why are they doing this? What's going on now in the scene? Oh, she's seducing me. How dare you? You say, no.
He didn't mind last time I did it.
So you have to work with the body more and understand the body so you don't disconnect. The sad part, is that that's the greatest disease of today, that our brain is in too many places, and it's not, you know, you're thinking about what your phones are saying and what's going next and what you didn't do this morning. So your brain can go very quickly in other parts, and some of your actors may be thinking about, oh shit, I left the gas on while they're doing the scene. They say, oh, you know. But that happens. It does happen.
No, it's true. Physical engagement does massively translate into mental engagement. And yeah, certainly it's one of the things which, again, when I'm teaching, I always make sure that when I get people to sort of sit on the ground, I never let them sit like with their bums on the floor so they can't get up. So I know you need to sit in a way that means that you can stand up if I need you to stand up. So it just makes such a difference having just a little bit of engagement in the body.
And I've worked with 2 or 3 actors who use music. Depending on the scene, because sets are so noisy, and sometimes there's nowhere for an actor to sit, and they'll listen to particular pieces of music, which kind of help them go into the next scene. I think that's can be really useful.
So it's hard for me to say this, but thank you very much. Thank you very much for being so present. Thank you very much for being so present, Francesca, Mikey, and JeanLouis. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this. I think probably you have a little bit of time, so if there's another question,